Thank you for being here today. I am Susan Winkler, and I serve as Chief Executive Officer of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. The foundation is the nonprofit, non-government organization created by the U.S. Congress to support FDA in doing more to protect and promote the public's health. Quickly, some housekeeping notes. We will be posting a recording of this meeting after the meeting concludes. The report that we're going to talk about is now posted on the on the Reagan-Udall website. And hopefully you took some of that technical time where we were not available to go and grab that report and start reading it, because that is what we are going to talk about today. Our slides and a recording of this meeting and a transcript will also be posted on the website. And I believe we're dropping a link into the chat right now. So what are we going to cover? The timelines that we have on the agenda slide, which is next, are going to shift just a little bit, but we will still wrap up by 12:30. So I'm going to briefly recap the main contents of our research project and the resulting report. We will then hear powerful stories from two medical students sharing their experiences with misinformation in patient care settings. We'll jump into a panel discussion with stakeholders reacting to the report. And finally, we have time for remarks from FDA Commissioner Dr. Califf. So let's talk a little bit about the digital health information environment and how that has changed how we access information and the challenge of misinformation. So let's remember, misinformation is not new, but how information and thus misinformation is shared and accessed is new. It has changed dramatically in recent years as consumers increasingly find health information online. It's a growing challenge for the entire healthcare community, including the FDA. We know the FDA plays a critical role in America's health by regulating the products we use every day. But if as consumers, we misunderstand those products or the FDA's role in regulating them, it can undermine the intended effect of FDA action, and we can be confused about how to use those products. So it is important to have good information. And as the commissioner has highlighted, the growing problem of misinformation undermines confidence in science and in public health institutions. So let's talk about our project. Earlier this year, which is on the next slide, earlier this year, Commissioner Califf requested that our foundation conduct research and do a research project to better understand how consumers find, consume, and perceive health information, particularly regarding FDA-regulated products. And I'll say that I'm going to use the phrase health information because that is broadly speaking to health and food information. This is not just about medical products, but really across the entire array of FDA-regulated industry. So from January to September, we've been working on this to understand consumer perspectives on a micro level. We had 3 listening sessions, 2 with consumers and 1 with healthcare professionals. From a macro level, we conducted a poll asking a representative sample of consumers questions about what sources of health information are most useful to them. And to engage with stakeholders, we convened 4 roundtable conversations, gathering representatives from FDA-regulated companies, academic experts, health professionals, and digital health information sources. And we turned to more than 25 experts from public health, communications, technology policy, media, government, and other fields. So what did we find? On the next slide, we'll be referring back to this concept quite routinely. But the primary finding is that clear, consistent communication, both to consumers directly via media channels, is critical to the FDA's mission to protect and promote the public health. Now, to be clear, what we're not saying here is that FDA should speak more loudly or generally even more often, but rather that it's important to enhance communications, to listen, to create space for consumers and professionals to ask questions, and to further explain inherently difficult concepts. We tee up here that as important as science and policy are to a science-based regulatory agency, communication is just as important and needs to become even more ingrained as a part of what the agency does in communicating directly, as well as what the agency does in empowering other stakeholders to communicate and share accurate information as we understand it today. It's a combination of sound science, sound policy, and sound communication are fundamental to the agency's success and thus consumers being able to use FDA regulated products to their greatest advantage. Let me also say that developing clear and consistent communication has never been easy for the agency. And with public access to so much information of varying quality and integrity, that task grows more difficult. As a science-based regulatory agency, FDA has to navigate inherently changing nature of science. We learn more and then advice may change. Also, FDA has to work within statutory and regulatory structures that dictate process and boundaries for regulatory decision making and protection of commercial information. The agency must frequently share decisions without the ability to disclose significant portions of underlying confidential data or information. Legal proceedings further animate and adjust those boundaries, which creates an uncertain and inherently uncomfortable environment. But despite, or maybe because of those challenges, purposeful investment in communications throughout the agency is necessary. Another challenge for FDA is that they do a lot. So the agency is constantly sharing information, and some decisions or actions have been in years in the making, and it's difficult. Then there's a challenge in communicating that to take those who have lived and breathed that work and very deeply understand it, to then communicate about it to a public that may have had little awareness that the work was even being done. Striking the right balance of background information and depth of explanation isn't easy. So to be clear, what we've teed up here in talking about pre-bunking information, I'll talk a little bit about this. None of this is a magic wand, but instead of magic, it's about the science of communication. What you'll find in the report are proven strategies and tactics that experts have used and continue to recommend. Where the FDA has taken steps toward implementing these strategies, and they are doing a lot of excellent work, we suggest additional investment, focus, and scale. So 3 quick notes here. It's important in addressing potential misconceptions to pre-bunk and attempt to avert misunderstandings in the first place. Pre-bunking health misinformation often entails anticipating how an intended audience might misinterpret a given message and adjust accordingly, or even explicitly rebut an anticipated error before it arrives. Pre-bunking also involves cultivating the health, media, and digital literacy skills that consumers need to discern accurate information in a complex information environment. So our report recommends strategies for the FDA to help consumers find and understand credible health information themselves, whether that's from FDA or from other trusted messengers. It's important to deliver credible information through others, through messengers who people are already understanding, and so for the FDA to speak with them, and that the responsibility for communicating should be infused throughout the agency and embraced as a way of making sure that the agency work is heard and understood. So I'll note that you can find the full report, Strategies for Improving Public Understanding of FDA-Regulated Products, on our website at Reagan-Udall.org. But let's do a little bit here and hear about why it's important, just to remind us the importance of the impact of misunderstanding or misinformation. I had a pleasure to hear from these 2 students who have invested time connecting with patients, learning from them, and understanding their experiences with misunderstanding and misinformation. I heard these presentations at a forum sponsored by the American Board of Internal Medicine Foundation, and I hope you find their presentations as powerful as I did. I'm going to first turn to Meher Kalkat. Meher is a 3rd-year medical student at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. The floor is yours, Meher.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. So I will just be speaking a bit about one of my experiences with misinformation. I set the microwaved cup of instant coffee down on the table so hard that it sloshes. He looks at me with guarded eyes. Despite trying to stay positive, this is not exactly an ideal start. Working with refugees seeking asylum in the US has taught me that trust is not easily won, and nor should it be. For someone who has lost so much to tell you the stories of their lives, it requires the willingness to try establishing a connection over and over again. David, you need a root canal due to the deterioration of your teeth. I explain the procedure to him and its importance to his health, but he shakes his head vigorously at me to make me understand. No, they will sell my teeth to the government. They will use it to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. David's fears are far from unfounded. His deep mistrust of the medical system is born from experiences in his home country, where the government would arrest people for crimes they didn't commit, and healthcare providers would turn over patients to the police. His misinformed beliefs are rooted in conversations with other refugees who have warned him that people may pretend to help him only to send him back to his home country. He has little reason to trust me after a few hours of meetings over the past few weeks. My eyes settle on his knuckles glowing white as he clutches the coffee cup. I soften my voice. I know it is scary. The procedure is completely safe. All they will do is... He cuts me off, exclaiming in frustration, "No, I already told you I don't want it." Instead of immediately responding, I take a moment. My mind wanders to my niece, remembering her eyes brimming over with tears as she told us that she didn't want to go to the dentist because it would hurt. We took some time to show her a YouTube video explaining what each of the tools did until her tears subsided. Maybe combating misinformation isn't just about the information itself, but finding the best way to communicate it to another person. I pull up a video on YouTube that explains David's procedures. I watch as his tense shoulders relax, settling into gentle curves just as the frown on his lip settles. I ask, a little too tearfully, "So, what do you think?" He looks at me for a moment. He is still unsure, but I can see his grip on the styrofoam cup loosening. I allow myself a moment to hope. Not today, I think. He hitches his jacket over his shoulder as he prepares to leave the appointment. I feel the familiar stone of disappointment settle in my stomach as I shuffle the stack of paper stained with coffee. He pauses at the door. Next week? Next week we can watch the video again? I smile wider. Nod. We can watch again next week. Maybe I'll even write a song to convince you. David nods back at me. Not exactly a smile, but an affirmation we will try again next week, and the week after, and as many weeks as he will allow me to try to earn his trust. Now, I wish I could say that the story ended in a clear success, but David and I are still working on him getting the procedure. We continue to show up, week after week, trying to meet each other in the middle. Misinformation is a door that offers a peek into the corners of another person's mind. Although these conversations may be fraught with tension and disagreement, they're also an opportunity to understand more deeply. Building trust is a series of small steps that doesn't always arrive at a clear solution. Although it may not always have the outcome I hope for, these appointments are just as valuable as ones where mutual trust comes quickly. I believe the most difficult piece is accepting that agreement is not always promised. My first months of medical school were energized with the idealism that I could win over every patient. Now, I have a more subdued approach. I sit beside the patients. I listen without judgment. I wonder about the amalgamation of life experiences that have led them to their ingrained beliefs, value systems, in this very conversation. I do not pretend to have all the answers. Perhaps this is ultimately what draws us together. Even at odds, reaching out across a vast divide, we can all acknowledge that we are just doing our best to find meaning amidst the messy beats of life. So that even if our conversation doesn't end with agreement, a handshake, or a root canal, there's a promise to keep reaching across the divide, listening and sharing stories over a lukewarm cup of coffee. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meher. We'll listen and share stories. Our next speaker is Alina Kirkarina, who is a second-year medical student at the Frank H. Netter School of Medicine at Quinnipiac University. Alina, would you take the stage?
Hi. Are you sure? The question was addressed to the physician in the room, but his gaze was on me, like he was looking for a second, differing opinion. If we're being honest, I'm usually not sure. The amount of information available at our fingertips can be overwhelming. As a first year medical student, I often struggle to trust myself, but I trust the process of my training. Since starting my preclinical years, my knowledge base has been tested, stretched, and built upon at an exceeding rate. Every other Tuesday, I get to see real patients, practice interview skills, and apply new material through a clinical mentorship program. It is in these encounters that I learn about more than the organ system of the week. It is in these encounters that I witness fear and vulnerability turn into trust. It was also in one of these encounters that I first met Sergio. Sergio was a year younger than me. He was wearing glasses and a hoodie. He had his phone in his hand and his backpack propped up against the exam room table. We hit it off right away, but I could tell that he was nervous. The week before, he was helping a neighbor with a construction project where he inhaled some dust and debris. The exposure was brief and limited, but he was nonetheless concerned. The next day, he was nonetheless concerned. He had read online that vigorous exercise could clear out his lungs following exposure. Not only did it not help, but for the first time in years, it exacerbated his asthma. The next day, he woke up with a new pain in his back, right where his lung would be. I've been trained to ask patients what they think might be causing their symptoms. You can learn a lot with this question, like their cultural or spiritual beliefs around illness. It can shed light on their prior healthcare experiences, medical history, or family history. But most importantly, it gives patients a judgment-free space to share their concerns, something they might have heard, something they might have read. When I asked Sergio what he thought might be causing his pain, he didn't miss a beat. Lung scarring, he told me. He wanted to discuss potential long-term effects and if this would lead to a serious disease. As the physician worked through his list of concerns, reassuring him along the way, he'd push back. Yes, I understand, but he'd circle back to something else he'd read. He had it pulled up on his phone. He could show us. The issue with online information is that it's often out of context. Internet searches tend to identify rare or worst case scenarios. Misinformation and misinterpretation often go hand in hand, and it's hard to navigate this space alone. Caring for vulnerable patients requires trust, comfort, and thoughtful communication to alleviate the anxiety that patients often experience in these situations. Teachable moments in clinic are an opportunity for these values to shine. The physician I was working with was good at teachable moments. I watched her pull up images on her computer to show patients exactly what she's talking about when referring to anatomy. With Sergio, I watched her do what his online searches couldn't. I followed along as she connected his medical history and his experience and story to his current symptoms. I listened as she walked us through her line of thinking. We found out that he's not usually that active, and swinging a hammer in that manner was a new motion for his body. Most importantly, we were able to pinpoint a muscle group that aligned with where he felt the pain. To his visible relief, it was not his lung. We no longer have a stronghold on medical information, but we have the skills of empathy, connection, and context. The ability to assess, interpret, and contextualize signs and symptoms is a gift. For Sergio, it provided the reassurance he desperately needed in that moment. The amount of information available online can be overwhelming, but teachable moments help to build trust for patients and medical students alike. It's moments like these that engage patients in their care and start to rebuild the foundation of trust and partnership. I am now in my second year of medical school, and it's unlikely that I will see Sergio again. But this encounter has stayed with me as an example of the importance of misinformation and teachable moments. I hope it has stayed with him too.
Alina, thank you so much. Meher and Alina, thank you for sharing your time. And we know that you need to return to your studies, but we appreciate you joining us this morning. So let's turn to discussion. During today's panel, we'll hear perspectives and reactions to the report, along with some of the ways that they may consider utilizing the suggested strategies and tactics. So we have 6 speakers who are joining us. I want to make sure that they all turn on their cameras and unmute their microphones. I'm confident we'll have transmission of both audio and visual, and let's just go ahead and jump into the conversation with these 6. So if we pull those slides down, Dr. Moyer, I'm going to turn to you first. In your role as Vice President of Regulatory Compliance and Global Food Safety Standards for the International Fresh Produce Association, you interact with the agency in a number of different ways, and your members often communicate with consumers about their products and sometimes FDA action. As you read this report, what strikes you as the most important takeaway?
Yes, thank you, Susan, and thank you so much for the invitation to participate today. I'll start with just a very quick high-level background of IFPA, just in case the listeners aren't familiar with us. So International Fresh Produce Association is a trade association representing almost 3,000 companies from every segment of the global fresh produce and floral supply chain. So we represent everyone from growers to processors, retailers, service providers, and anyone in between. So as you said, strong, accurate communication about the health and safety of our products is absolutely crucial to our industry. We know a vast majority of consumers already don't eat the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables each day. Misunderstandings and misperceptions of these products and the way in which FDA regulates these products can directly impact. So I would say overall, my impressions as I was reading through this report was just a very consistent, yes, I want to see more of that, more the strategies that were pointed out, the different tactics. Without breaking down each one of them, I'll mention one sentence that really struck out to me. And Susan, I think you mentioned this in your overview, along with a few observations that build into that, is that sound science, sound policy, and sound communication are each fundamental to the agency's mission, and they should be resourced and approached with the same diligence. So a big part of my role is as a science communicator, but I don't consider myself to be a communications professional. I am a scientist. I am a policy person first, and that's my bias. But the idea that communication should be resourced and prioritized just as much as those other 2 components really resonated with me. And I do agree. I think that is a gap. I think the natural tendency is to say that, well, it's the science, it's the actual work being done that's most important. And inherently, that makes sense to me. But we've also seen from experience, we've learned that when it comes to topics that are both technical in nature as well as deeply personal in nature, deeply emotional, you cannot let that work just speak for itself. So I completely agree that there is this lack of consumer understanding in how the FDA regulates our foods. And there are a few different reasons for that, but communication is a big part of it. And to start to resolve that lack of understanding, to get ahead of that misinformation, to pre-bunk it, that was a new term for me. It's consistent and proactive communication, not just when there's a foodborne outbreak, not just when there is news articles making the rounds about how the EU bans a certain ingredient and the FDA doesn't, or not just when there's social media videos making the rounds about how to cook your chicken in NyQuil. I think we need to have that proactive, consistent communication that's intentional and collaborative with other subject matter experts. Those were all, I think, themes of the report, and I think we would all of us be better communicators if we incorporated those practices into our own organizations.
Emily, thanks so much. I'm struck in the collaborative piece and the opportunity for some consistency then. So it's not just the agency communicating, but you've pulled out, this idea that it's a number of others that have access to the information to then be able to communicate.
Absolutely. I think we are all FDA and industry members alike. We are experts of our own realm, of our own areas. But we also have limited resources. So to the extent that we can collaborate as much as possible, I think we'll all be better off.
Fabulous. Dr. Alvarez, I'm going to turn to you. Wolters Kluwer might fall in the super user category of some of FDA's medical product information. As Director of Content Harmonization for Clinical Effectiveness there, what do you see as important in this report?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity and a really great job. Well done on the report. I really think it is much needed. And this problem of misinformation has, frankly, gotten a little too out of hand. So I will say just to give you a little bit of perspective, what Wolters Kluwer does, we collate a lot of information and we utilize the experts, the world's experts in the particular fields that we provide information in. And that information is synthesized and put in front of clinicians who use our content every day, both pharmacists, physicians, nurses. So I will say there's a lot of great advice in the report. From a healthcare professional perspective, as a pharmacist, I saw observation number 4 really struck me. We know that healthcare professionals are the most trusted when it comes to providing health information. Interestingly, based on a Gallup poll that was done, it's done every year, we also know that nurses are the most trusted healthcare professional. Now, pharmacists, physicians, and nurses are always competing friendly for this spot, but I really think that nurses are really able to do this well, and they have become really the patient's friend, their advocate, and they are really able to interpret the health information, the diagnosis that's been delivered by the physician, and they can have time for those one-on-one conversations, as long as they do have time, I should say. And this was well said by Meher and Alina, that we really need those teachable moments. And I will say in all of healthcare, the ability to have these conversations is really getting tougher and tougher. From a pharmacy perspective, with the advent of big box retail chain pharmacies, I believe this is especially tough in the world of pharmacy. There's less time to spend with the patient, whereas with these smaller independent pharmacies, which are becoming, frankly, less and less, unfortunately, there's a greater opportunity to have these one-on-one conversations, mostly due to lower volumes of drugs and better staffing ratios. So I believe that the FDA can really improve the access to information, to key communication tools for healthcare professionals and their patients. There's some really great examples that we saw through the COVID pandemic. One that comes to mind is, if your patient asks this is what your response might be, based on the science. But again, I will say that our professionals are stretched these days and understaffed. So this impact, I believe, is impacting the level of trust between us and our patients. So some hospitals are even being forced to bring on travel nurses, and up to 80% of the staff can be a travel nurse. So this is really beginning to be a problem, having the time to talk to your patients and to have those teachable moments. So I would say that with the staffing shortages that we're seeing in healthcare, that really providing these tools to clinicians would be super helpful and really big time savers for us. And I also think that just being in the loop sooner when it comes to new information produced by the Food and Drug Administration, as appropriate, this was one of the strategies that was outlined. It would be great if we knew in advance. That way we're not surprised when patients come to us for advice. So overall, I thought the report was amazing, super helpful, and it had some really nice strategies that I think the agency can take to heart. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. And you teed up and mentioned physicians and time and a number of other things, which then makes me want to turn to Dr. Barron. The American Board of Internal Medicine and the ABIM Foundation have done a lot of work on misinformation and building trust. And as noted, physicians can be one of those particularly powerful messengers. Dr. Barron, what did you find most interesting about the research and the report?
Well, first of all, Susan, I want to congratulate you and your colleagues for overseeing something that I think produces very useful guidance. I found it quite striking that you're very clear in the preface even that this is really meant for the entire agency. This is meant for anybody working at FDA can and should look at this and can and should think about opportunities it creates for them. At the highest level, I'll underscore what Emily said earlier, that recognizing that science and policy are not self-executing, even though those are the things that you mostly need to focus on as an agency that's curating science and developing policy, recognizing that that without communications, science and policy aren't going to go anywhere. I think that's a really profound insight, and I applaud you for having that insight. I think you also demonstrate in the report a much more sophisticated understanding of what the current communication environment look like than frankly most folks have or most agencies have. One of the things that we've used as kind of a guide, we worked with a consultant at ABIM who said, I'm going to tell you three things you need to know. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about social media in 3 slides. And the first slide is a guy on a stepladder with a megaphone talking to a bunch of people in a field. And he says, that's communications from Gutenberg till now. The only question is, how big is your stepladder? How loud is your megaphone? Well, on the second slide, some of the people in the field have megaphones. They're talking back. It's, oh, wait, your customers actually can communicate with you. But it's the third slide that's really dramatic. Same guy, same stepladder, same megaphone. Everybody in the field has a megaphone. They're all talking to each other and ignoring the person on the stepladder. The challenge for the FDA, for an agency, is you're on a stepladder with a megaphone talking to a bunch of people, and maybe they're paying attention to you, but maybe they're actually paying attention to a much more diverse communications environment in which they live. And that requires you to adopt different kinds of strategies. And I particularly found the idea of trying to empower and humanize the people who work at the FDA to try to get across to them that one of the things they can be doing is they can be communications messengers, and also thinking about various other people, including physicians and pharmacists, and frankly, even pharma and regulated bodies. And then the other thing that I found really quite striking is that I think people assume that the world that the FDA has made safe is just safe because of itself, that the FDA almost disappears as something that keeps our food safe, that keeps our medications safe, that allows us to believe that if we're buying a prescription medication that says there's 10 milligrams of the drug in it, that there's pretty close to 10 milligrams of the drug in it. And we all just take that for granted. And I think we don't realize how much the very existence of the FDA has made our food safe, has made our medication safe, has made a bunch of things reliable. And so I think the reports calling out the opportunity for the FDA to tell the story of the work it already does, I thought that was a really important observation as well.
Thank you so much, Rich. And you and Bill remind me that we recognize, as busy as healthcare professionals are, that the FDA is busy too, right, doing their work. And so part of this will be how can that communications emphasis be woven in, not stacked upon.
That sounds exactly right. And I think that again, reading some history, I'm learning that the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1905 or 1906 that kind of established a federal role for this, that the world in which that happened was a world in which physicians were prescribing what were called patent medications, where it didn't even say on the label what was in it. and it was cocaine and it was heroin and it was alcohol, and it didn't even say what was in it. And the original enabling legislation, if you're going to put medication out there, you have to tell people what's in it.
Right.
And we just have assumed that, well, of course that's how it's going to work. And frankly, that is a huge leap forward. And I think all of us acknowledging how much we rely on that can boost FDA, that doctors reminding patients, pharmacists reminding patients, we're operating in a regulated environment that is much safer by benefit of that regulation. And lots of things we take for granted that don't happen in other parts of the world happen reliably in this country, and we should celebrate that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And so then I'm so struck by science and policy aren't self-executing. And I think there's one of our panel members who lives this every day. And that's Lori, as CEO at the National Association of County and City Officials. I can just imagine that you live that every day as well. And your members use FDA information in yet a different way. What would you highlight from this project?
Well, first, thanks for including me. Also, I really did appreciate very much the report. And I loved the strategies and tactics that were provided to counter the mis and disinformation as well. I think for our 3,000 local health departments across the country, we were in a really unique state for several years here. We still live in this space where we're in the receiving end of consumers that are consistently questioning traditional health information and how they're hearing it and learning about it. And it's because of all the mixed messaging, the misalignment of messaging, incorrect information, and quite honestly, late or lack of information that creates this vacuum, by which misinformation then fills the void. So if people don't have the data or factual information they need to make healthy choices and decisions for themselves, there are always others ready to fill the gap with made up information. We have to really, start to take a defensive strategy against this rather than a passive approach to it and wait for that misinformation to come. I think the key things that I appreciated seeing in the report were things like getting out ahead early, sustained, coordinated messaging from multiple and trusted messengers. Ideally before the misinformation begins or becomes widespread. We can't be complacent about the communications, has to be front and center to our work with the public at all times. And that is the only thing that is going to lead us back on the path to building the trust in the governmental agencies that the public has lost so much of. I think that I appreciated the use of the term pre-bunking, that terminology and that methodology, for exactly the same reasons I said, getting out ahead of it, trying to understand and predict where that could emerge and for what reasons, and really using that truth sandwich to get us back to a good place with people, reiterating the correct information and the facts, continuing to push out the correct information in between the misinformation. I love the partnership building aspects of the recommendations. Even though local health departments on the ground are luckily part of the trusted messenger community, even though they're government agencies, they're still trusted because they're further distanced from the federal government. So we have a unique role there. Often as kind of the backbone organization that is working with community-based organizations to deepen messages into vulnerable communities. So loved that reference to having to work closer to the ground with providers on the ground, health departments on the ground to really get closer to community. And then I would just end with we saw, I think there are instances where we have to fight harder with misinformation because people are dying from it. And we had this during the pandemic with ivermectin, and in our rural communities, and just people just crazily taking this medicine, this for farm animals, that wasn't intended to address the pandemic. And we saw a lot of rural communities where their close-knit communities where friends were dying from misinformation around ivermectin. And it really hit these communities hard. It really is that teachable moment when we know we have to get deeper into community and people to people talk about what the truth is and what how we rely on that information. So overall, just appreciate so much everything in the report. And I'm looking forward to the next part of the conversation around different things that we might consider as well.
Absolutely. We'll be coming back to you with that. So Dr. Wagner, I'm not sure how much you thought about the FDA before we called you and say, hi, would you like to be on a roundtable and share your expertise? Because you look at this challenge in a very different way, and you do your own research on this at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Share your expertise with us. What do you think about the strategies and tactics suggested?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Susan. And I really enjoyed the report. It was great to see so much of the conversation we all had with a bunch of other experts in this domain find its way into different observations and tactics in the report. I think it's really exciting. I direct the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal at UW-Madison, where we study how individuals' engagement in the overall information ecology, so the news they get, the people they talk to, the social media they see, how those things influence what people believe to be true, what they want from their political leaders, and how they engage civically. And a lot of that deals with how folks are exposed to and respond to misinformation and its correction. And so the report, was read with great interest by me. I just wanted to walk through just real brief responses to the observations. One, to kind of endorse them as evidence-based, and then two, to push the FDA's thinking forward with respect to how to use these observations effectively based upon research and misinformation correction and that sort of thing. And so in terms of that first observation, I think it's just critical and so smart to start there with sharing the role of the FDA and why the processes that are undertaken are trustworthy processes. I think it would be useful to add that these processes have an ongoing and over time record of success. And so it's not just that we had a good process this time, it's that our process is always one that is something that we can defend no matter what the topic. And also thinking a bit about other trust boosters in this domain might be to also reference who monitors you. And so just knowing that there is a monitor is something that's very comforting to skeptical audiences. And so that can be something that boosts the trust about the process the FDA undertakes. I think folks are right on with that second observation. And I think one other thing that could be useful there is to just recognize that it's not just that we need to keep ahead of claims, but that we need to also communicate to audiences that a lot of misinformation is actually recycling old claims or reusing strategies on a different issue. And highlighting those two things have been demonstrated to be effective strategies at mitigating people's belief of things that aren't verifiably true. And so describing how this is the same tactic that was used to foment skepticism about another issue is a way to help people understand that what's happening here is less a conspiracy and more a tactic of trying to sow misinformation. In terms of the third observation, I think consistency is hugely important. I think one other thing the FDA can do, and which is another kind of trust booster, is admit when the FDA has fallen short of a goal. And so was there a time when communication wasn't as clear as it could have been? And that led to people having uncertainty about what the right thing to do is. Admitting that and saying, here's how we've corrected that shortcoming can be really effective, and then help communication be more consistent over time. The point about trustworthy messengers is huge, especially with respect to local trustworthy messengers. And I was just thinking about Lori's point about rural communities, which I think is just right on. And from a communication standpoint, they're losing local newspapers, which are the most trusted source of information in communities. And when communities lose their local paper, they don't replace it with other local information. They replace it with national and more ideological news, which increases the difficulty of your problem when it comes to combating misinformation. And so highlighting those local trustworthy messengers, I think is just critically important. And so I was really happy to see that observation. And then finally, and I think this is probably, in some respects, the hardest thing to do, but is maybe the most important, is it is the case that the FDA has this hugely important coordinating role, and that coordinating role can help in the consistency of the information that's shared about different kinds of topics, whether that's about combating misinformation, whether that's about pre-bunking potential misinformation. The truth sandwich method is always a great a way of trying to communicate things that we know are verifiably true. And I would say one other thing that the FDA could play a role in from a coordinating perspective is to help different communicators think about how they're going to convey uncertainty. So much of what is communicated as a strategy is because it's the best option we have. It's not always the case that following the strategy means we're going to solve the problem completely, that we're going to eliminate people from, getting COVID or spreading COVID. It's about mitigating risk. And so the way that we communicate uncertainty, it becomes critically important, so that that's done in a consistent way, which makes it harder for people who want to share evidence or share things. Shouldn't say evidence, share things that aren't true. It makes it harder for them to do that when the communication about what's uncertain is clear and consistent, and refers back to that process that you highlight in the first observation. So thanks so much for the opportunity to engage with you all, and congrats on the report.
I have to say, Dr. Wagner, in true professorial style, you walked us through the report and response, which was so helpful. Dr. Baxter, I'm going to close out our initial question with you. At the Science Haven, you are routinely thinking about how to better communicate science information, which is a major part of FDA's efforts. As you noted in our technical difficulties, we should have shot up a meme about technical difficulties. And if we were as facile and as advanced as the Science Haven, we could do that. So tell us what you see in the report. We absolutely want to continue to learn from you and from all of our colleagues here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan. I want to express my gratitude for being a part of this critical convo. As a science communicator, I recognize the essential role that we play in bridging the gap between complex science information and the public. And in the report from the Foundation, I saw a really strong acknowledgement of the challenges that we face in disseminating accurate health information, especially on social media. The prevalence of health misinformation is very concerning, but I'm also extremely encouraged by the strategies and interventions that were proposed to combat it. Also, as a science educator, I was very pleased to see, as others shared, the notion of pre-bunking and its proposed methodology. I see it as a strong motion toward not just communication, but the essence of what education actually is. I think if you read some scholarly literature around the differences between science communication, science education, there are many parallels, and there are intersections, but there's also argued differences between the two. And so I love this movement toward being a source of education as well as communication. And I see it as a focused intention on building scientific literacy for the public so that they're actually educated enough to engage with the communication that the governments are aiming to provide. Because it's one thing for an entity to say something, but you actually have to make it mean something. What does the communication mean to your audience, and how are you intentionally engaging in that meaning-making process? So social media can be very double-edged, right? It can be a very useful tool to share information. But then again, it can also be a weapon against the information. So I really liked reading that information in the report. And then tying back to the actual nature of social media, right? It was meant to build community. It started on these social networks where you could add your friend, right? Or participate in groups. And then it blossomed into something that we probably could never imagine, right? All of these different networks and different means of access. We have apps, we have websites. There's so many things, and I think that this is something we should not discredit or overlook, the community aspect of social media. I feel like health misinformation and tackling it is a collective responsibility. And Susan, you mentioned my work at the Science Haven. I'm executive director there. It's a nonprofit, and we as a group are made up of people across law, education policy. We have a NASA astrophysicist in there, and then I'm a science communicator, but we all are very community driven. And so we strive to make not just scientific information accessible, engaging, and understandable, but also provide greater access to being a part of the scientific community. And that is for everyone, not for just people with scientific backgrounds, but all. So, for example, our flagship initiative, it's called Stellar Dreams. And the goal is to distribute 100 telescopes to underserved students and their families across the country. But notice I said the students and their families are getting the telescopes, and we're not just giving the telescopes, we're going to be guiding them in citizen science opportunities as well. And a lot of those opportunities have connections to government organizations like NASA and NOAA, and others. And so we also know that involvement in science in one area of science is often a gateway to many other fields of science. So it's not just about astronomy, but equipping students and their families with access to scientific communities and educating them so that they can be a part of scientific conversations. And so that all has, it's a very multifaceted process or project, but we're hoping to increase scientific literacy and participation in science as a whole through this very simple thing of giving access to a scientific tool. So I loved the report. I thought it was very thorough, and I'm excited to see what everyone else's takeaways are as well.
Thanks so much, Dr. Baxter. And I'm intrigued with right. It's part of that common element of science. If we can do better in communicating in one area of science, that should play through in others as well. So let's do a round though on what's missing or understated in the report. And Laura, you brought this up, and I want to make sure we know that there are things that could be improved. So what would you say is missing or understated? I'll let you pick up the mic first.
Yeah, and I would categorize these as not necessarily improvements, but building on this report, things we should consider perhaps. I think first, we underrate communication skills in our workforce, don't we? We don't build the workforce competency to communicate consistently, culturally sensitive, encompasses everything we know about communities at risk, often hardest to reach. So there are only 600 PIOs in this country in governmental public health. There's a severe lack of expertise, trained expertise. So how do we want more people to communicate across the agencies and to be able to do it, but we have to train them how to do it and do it correctly. I think the other things that I would say that could be picked up on as themes to build upon, or this idea that the medical students in their powerful stories referenced about let's take a look at the community. Let's take a look at the people. What is the root of the attitudes and the emotions that are affecting their health decisions? How are they making these health decisions, and what information are they seeking? They will tell us if we ask them, and that should be the basis for how we communicate with them, including the method used to communicate with them, and who communicates with them, and how they receive information. And then I think finally, I would just say that we would we need to lead in the tech space a little bit more here. I mean, there are bots introduced all day long that have negative information, misinformation. Let's release a boatload of bots that have nothing but powerful truth to them, and just counter technology with technology, because they're beating us at our own game here. Thank you.
That's a kind of fascinating. That is definitely a piece that we I think the whole technology opportunity is one that is yet to explore in this area. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lori. Rich, what would you say is understated or missing, or is something that we should be sure to build upon?
So it would be a variation actually on what Lori just said. I think that what's happening now is that misinformation circulates rapidly in a corrupt information ecosystem. And there needs to be able to counter it, some kind of monitoring capacity. And that's not a trivial thing, either as a technical problem or frankly as a policy problem for an agency of the United States federal government. That the whole set of issues that start to be evoked when government is trying to tune into the conversation everybody's having, that's going to make a lot of people very apprehensive and cross a lot of boundaries. And of course, we have the recent litigation around Missouri versus Biden, and FDA doesn't seem to have been named in that specifically, but CDC was, and the White House was, and the Surgeon General was, and it isn't at all clear that that other federal agencies wouldn't be swept into the same. Somehow, you're not supposed to do that. So I think that it's hard to say. I don't know so much that this is something that's missing, but it's a dimension I'd want to be aware of, that it is challenging for the federal government to take on this role. One of the reasons why the Udall Foundation can do the work it's doing is you're not the federal government, and you can advise them in a more independent way. But I think that inevitably, and there's an article in this week's New England Journal about an LGBTQ clinic at Harvard Medical School that somebody put out the false story that they were doing gender transitions in infants. And that was outrageous enough to kind of go around the world. And it was completely false. And the author calls at the end for, we need to have coordinated responses to misinformation and falsehoods. And that is both a technological problem and a policy problem, and ultimately, depending on how things go with the government in Missouri versus Biden, a legal problem that there may be some constraints on the way the government can get involved in this, in which case the private sector is going to have to figure out a way to do this.
Really important, and back to that kind of idea of collaboration, as well as continuing to build on that technology. And I think you've pointed out listening more.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
The report
Emily,
call for social listening tools, and I think that's an important thing. But I think amplifying how challenging that is for FDA to do that, both technically and politically, is more where I'd go.
Yeah. Important caveat. Emily, what I'm sure there are some things that you thought should be emphasized or further explored. You get to pick up the mic.
Sure. Well, I'll start off by saying I really appreciate and completely agree with the comments from the other panelists. And I'll say a couple of ideas that jumped to my mind, some being a little bit, frankly, more selfish, putting on the food industry lens. One aspect that I think would be interesting to further explore is just starting to think through within this report some more specific food industry examples. I have really appreciated your clarification on the term health information, that it is inclusive of food and not just medicine and medical products, because of course the food we consume is directly related to our health, both in terms of in the short term from the safety standpoint, but as as well as long-term as we think about the nutritional aspects of the food we consume. And one aspect in which this came up for me is particularly in observation 4, which I think it was William who pointed this out as well, which focused on having that trusted figurehead who the agency can equip with tools to better communicate with patients or with consumers. When it comes to food, I'd say medical doctors are absolutely the first line of defense when it comes to things like detecting foodborne illness outbreaks, recognizing those symptoms, and certainly when it comes to nutrition. But they're not necessarily the people I would go to better understand, for example, how does the FDA now proactively regulate fresh produce at the farms in the US and internationally as a result of these really pivotal, semi-new FSMA regulations, or things like, what does a best if used by label mean? What do all of the different labels on our food mean? For good reason. I think that's not part of a medical doctor's expertise. I don't think Meher or Lena would necessarily be interested in adding another semester or year to their training just to become food law experts. But for me, it was a really interesting thought exercise. Just who is that equivalent trusted figure that FDA can collaborate with when it comes to messaging around food regulations? Or what is the WebMD website of the food world? So I would be interested in just hearing either the foundations or the agency's thoughts on that. And that really leads into, I think, my second point or second consideration about the report really is thinking about what comes next. What does the agency need to help get this done? What is the state of their staffing be able to execute these strategies? What do they currently have to be able to execute this? It sounded like I think that was a little bit outside the scope of this current report, but it would be helpful to understand just what is the current state of FDA's communication programs so that we can measure any future success or future progress in this area. It's a big challenge.
Yeah. Yes. And thanks, Emily. Important points. And I think you just put another thing in Deputy Commissioner for Human Foods, Jim Jones's job jar, that he gets to drop that in there and to consider. And you're right. This was not an evaluation of FDA's current communications. This was, let's look at misinformation and what is it that can be done. So thank you. Raven, I want to turn back to you. What would you have written differently if you had the pen for this project?
Yes, it's hard to say because it was so thoroughly conducted. But I would have loved to see more emphasis on two-way communication and more interactive strategies that the FDA can use to engage with the public. I think the report was very, very heavy on one-way communication, but in a great way that offered strategies for partnerships with different subject matter experts and healthcare professionals. But I would have loved to see proposals for how can the FDA talk directly to the public? As someone who specializes in science communication digitally and especially on social media, I can't help but to notice a lot of government organizations do not respond to questions, really valid questions and concerns that are presented online. And being how viral social media can be, I don't think it's in the FDA's best interest to leave many of those questions unanswered or unaddressed. But I do also realize that there are many policy regulations as far as how the FDA can communicate that probably gives rationale to why there are not many responses. But I maybe in the future would love to see more emphasis on two-way communication because that's also ultimately how you build community and how you learn about the people that you are trying to reach. You have to hear from them and listen to them and engage in that feedback. So other than that, I love the report.
So Raven, that's so important to underscore. And as you were sharing your remarks, I could hear my teenage son of a couple of years ago when he took his headphones out and he said, "Well, I can hear you. That doesn't mean I'm listening." And at least he was transparent. But I think it reminds us there is a distinct difference between hearing and listening, and then having that conversation and a dialogue. Really helpful. Bill, I want to turn to you. What would you say might be missing, or things that we need to improve on in the report or build on?
Sure. So a little, Lori and Rob talked a little bit about this in terms of the technology, but the FDA has to be able to get around these small voices that are very powerful, but they're only very powerful because of these algorithms that are created. So how does the FDA get a larger voice in social media? So there really needs to be some programmers that can really help with this and improve that and get them to have that louder voice. These smaller voices, it could be one person that says something as misinformation, and you get a couple of comments and a couple of likes, and it just gets to the top of your feed. And it's not to steal the First Amendment rights of our citizens, but it really is to just to get the FDA to start really getting the information out before that occurs, or and that goes back to the pre-bunking process, and really also educating our healthcare professionals as well in that as well. The other piece of it that I think would be super helpful, and I think Dr. Baxter spoke to this, is just the education that we need to have for our youth. They need to understand that the FDA is on your side, that they are here to help you, and they're here for public safety. So, and these, approving products, it's a long track. There's a lot of things that need to be done, randomized controlled clinical trials before these drugs get to market. Of course, the fast track process has gone to more phase 2 clinical trials first, and then the approval process. But it's great that the FDA has a requirement for those post-marketing studies. So important. But for the public to really understand that is so important. And I think starting with our youth and really getting the educational component in, and back to the Gallup poll that was done in terms of the most trusted most trusted professionals, teachers were also on that list, and they were not too far from pharmacists. So utilizing our teachers to actually teach our kids to understand how important the FDA and what the process is like is so important. So thanks again. The report was fantastic, and a lot of great stuff in there.
Well, and really helpful, that double down again on the technology, and then the teacher engagement. All right, let me turn. Michael, you probably write more than any of us on this call. What might you have cast differently if you had been writing here?
Well, again, I think the report was really strong, and I sort of walked through areas I thought the report might extend in my first set of comments. I won't repeat those things. I really want to plus one what Raven was saying about two-way communication, and what I think Emily was saying about expanding the coverage of issues to food and other things. And the reason I say that is that I think one thing that the report doesn't really get into, and I completely understand why, is the incredibly politicized nature of how people deal with misinformation. And I don't know if you've seen recent reporting in the Washington Post, or Fire just put out a thing this morning. A lot of people who are in the world I'm in studying misinformation are on the receiving end of congressional letters of inquiry and subpoenas for studying misinformation. And so highlighting the depoliticized nature of some of this works, about how what the FDA is doing is combating misinformation about food safety, right? About the safety of vaccine. Those kinds of things are less politicized than, say, misinformation about election results and things that really make it hard for folks on whatever the losing side is in that contest to want to listen to verifiably accurate information. So highlighting how the process is depoliticized, there are monitors, in that process. The top range is expansive and not just on hot button political issues. I think those are ways to help understand and acknowledge there's a deeply polarized political environment here that we have to think about, but that polarized political environment is somewhat independent of the role of the FDA when it comes to expressing these are things we know to be true, and here's how we know them, and here's how we want to engage in a two-way communication with you all about a variety of topics to make sure that the information is understood, is trusted, and then can be amended as we learn new things, right? As we reduce uncertainty and learn new things about the stuff we're working on.
That's a really just so helpful to think about the difference right there, that this is about helping people have the best information to then make their choices about their health, about the food they eat, the medical products they use, how they engage in using these products. Thank you so much, Michael. All right, so we're going to do a rapid fire. This is where I'm going to test each of you as communicators. All right. So the report, as we know, it was intended not just for the agency, but for many stakeholders to think about how they might improve the public's understanding of FDA regulated products. I'm going to turn to each of you for a 1 minute thought, up to 1 minute thought, about what you and your stakeholders might do differently in reaction to the report. So I'm going to do a quick round robin. Let me tell you the order. I'm going to do Raven, Michael, Bill, Emily, Lori, Rich. So Raven, Michael, Bill, you're up first. Raven, unmute and fire away.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm heavy on the education and building scientific literacy. So I think one thing that I will begin implementing is doing the work of breaking down those very basic core scientific concepts behind the misinformed information, and allowing people on my platform to ask questions, making myself available to help guide people on their understanding of the information that is circulating. And I will definitely be thinking of creative ways to make it an interactive process.
Awesome. And you're going to send me the meme on technical difficulties. Michael, Bill, Emily. Michael.
So I think coming out of this report, I think it's critical for people in my space to think about misinformation detection in a way that'll be helpful for agencies like the FDA. So it's not that we need to identify, we know that this thing is false, but instead say, we know that there's unverified information or information from sources that don't reveal their process. And so that is a space where we can jump in and say, we're not here to content moderate. We're here to say, here's evidence that we have, and here's our process, and here's how we know this evidence is good evidence, and just share it and give people the opportunity to make a choice. And then I think the second thing that comes out of this is just thinking about different subgroups of respondents, right? So it's not that it's a one size fits all messaging. It's a consistent messaging strategy that needs to reach different folks where they live, and that might relate to who's doing the communicating and what topics we're choosing to engage with in particular circumstances.
Fabulous. Great to have that additional research and follow-up. Bill, Emily, Lori. Bill.
Yeah, I will say that, at Wolters Kluwer, we have products that provide patient information. So we have UpToDate with disease patient information. We have LexiComp with patient drug information. We have Emmy that provides video support for patients. So I think, with the mindset of understanding that there's a lot of misinformation out there, where can we help with debunking or even pre-bunking ourselves with that process and developing our information? So super important. I think we have a major role in healthcare when it comes to providing that patient information. So that's where I see, this report impacting what we do. So I think it'll be very helpful.
Fabulous. That will be so powerful and helpful. Emily, Lori, and then Rich will have you close it out. Emily.
So I guess I think of an analogy in the way we communicate with consumers is the same as I communicate with my own members as we're training them on food safety regulations, food safety best practices, things of that nature. It's all about clear, consistent communication that meets consumers where they're at. Produce is very much focused on preventive food safety practices. They are far more effective than reactive food safety practices. And that is the same thing with communication. We need to focus on that proactive communication rather than reactive communication.
Just giving me a new tagline, Emily. Thank you. Lori and then Rich. Lori.
So I would like to use this report to kind of as a springboard with some of the other federal agencies that we work with to show them that you actually took the time to think through this and think through potential solutions and think about how it has impacted your agency. But, I'd really like to use it to garner some cross-agency support for more aligned communications and messaging, particularly where the work of the FDA touches on other agencies, like in the vaccine work with the CDC and so forth. So really trying to leverage what you've done here for others and maybe get some momentum behind it. I think ultimately we need to be transparent with our public about what we know, but also what we do not know. When we cannot afford to stay silent or appear to be paralyzed in the face of heightened community concern or misinformation. And we have to be prepared as we prepare for other emergencies. We have to be prepared for misinformation as an emergency.
Excellent. And certainly it's a public report. We welcome all, using it, improving upon it. Rich, turning to you for that last minute. Oh, you're muted.
Hard to add to what so many have said, but I think I'd say I'd like to use the report as a ray of hope. I think there is a way in which, in the current environment, so many people feel disempowered. People feel, gee, it's overwhelming, all this social media platform stuff, and how are you going to swim against that tide? And I think it was Bill who pointed out the trust in doctors, for instance, that the report calls out. Well, I think doctors right now do feel a certain kind of devalued, disempowered. Nobody listens to us. We just get pushed around. We're just employees. I think doing what we can to raise the pride and energy around this, to create a call for that part of what it means to be a healthcare professional in this environment is you got to take up arms against this. You got to get on the barricades. You got to go where you can go to do something. And if the FDA at its august level can try to think about differently about how do we engage in this challenge, you could easily have written a report that listed all the ways the FDA can't do this. Instead, you wrote a report of all the ways the FDA could. And I think that is, as I'll say, a ray of hope. And I would really want to encourage physicians everywhere to say, don't give up, use the platforms that you have, use the voices that you have, and also be aware of what's happening around us, because it really is different and we need different approaches.
Well, I don't know that there's a better phrase than a ray of hope. And so with that, I just have to say thank you so much to each of you for joining us. You've shared such rich ideas about how to build on this, and your contributions were just invaluable. We look forward to continuing to work on this together. With that, let's all step to the side, because the commissioner has been listening and reading, I think, while we were chatting. And so I want to say, Dr. Califf, we are so pleased to have prepared and give this report to you. And so I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Thanks, Susan. And I do want to express great appreciation to the whole team at Reagan-Udall. This took a lot of time and energy, and we know you put your hearts and souls into it in developing this report. You've given us a lot to think about and to focus on in the panel discussion just now. was a really interesting mixture, I thought, of call to action and concern about what's going on with many questions yet unanswered. I'll just offer a few points about the report. I hope we can expand upon in the discussion, which I hope will last for months after this report as we all digest it. In general, you've made a couple of essential points about what I regard as a very troubling issue, probably the most difficult one in my career. Having dealt with a lot of diseases, this overall issue of getting the right information to people is really an astounding challenge. The first is a critical need for the public to have access to accurate medical and scientific information because they got a lot of decisions to make. And the direct link between the information people get and the decisions they make that affect whether they live or die or have a functional life is increasingly obvious. Second is the vital importance of our own communications role at FDA to deliver accurate, understandable, and timely health information, both to the public, but also, you make the point quite well, to experts who are trusted by the public. And, you know, I tend to focus on clinicians and the importance, the role that they play as intermediaries, whether it's doctors, nurses, pharmacists. But I'm really glad someone brought up teachers, because above all else, our educational institutions need to be involved in this battle that's ongoing to have good, truthful, reliable information went out over misinformation. The third key point that I think you made is that understanding is the understanding that this is a huge and frustrating problem that doesn't have one magic solution. It's a challenge that we have to address head on and in real time. And it can only be effectively responded to through collaboration and teamwork. That holds for within the FDA. You make that point quite well. And Susan, you know as well as anybody, having been chief of staff here at the FDA in the past, that like all institutions, FDA can have its own balkanized factions, but also throughout the government. If we look at something like vaccines or controlling lipids or blood pressure, multiple government agencies have a role, and we could work together a lot better. But you've also made the point the whole public health sector and the educational sector need to be activated and involved. So I'll begin with the report's title, quote, Strategies for Improving Public Understanding of FDA-Regulated Products. Implicit in the title is one of the most basic and essential roles of the FDA. And in fact, the statement is in our mission statement, where it says, help the public get the accurate science-based information they need to use medical products and foods to maintain and improve their health. One thing that's left out of this mission statement, and you all didn't bring up, is sort of the inverse of information about health, and that's about tobacco, which is one of the huge issues that we're all dealing with. Almost 500,000 Americans will die from tobacco-related illness this year alone. And communication there is really an enormous part of the mission. So we've embraced this role, and we've attempted for many years to cultivate better communication using plain language and straightforward facts to communicate with the public in a whole variety of ways, informing them about safety of products and other consumer-based information, providing basic scientific factual information, filling in gaps, warning people about dangerous or deceptive products, giving them accurate nutritional information. And I could go on and on, but this gives you an idea that this is going to take the whole community if we're going to carry the day, because we literally are making dozens of decisions every single day, in all distributed among our 18,000 employees in over 250 locations around the world. And there's just no way that one central focus can control it all and make it work. So it's not a small challenge. And it's not just the number of people, but we've got all different types of people: scientists, clinical experts, lawyers, policymakers, who are involved in our activities. And it's interesting, as I've spent more time on this, to just consider the fact that these disciplines are somewhat characterized by taking pride in the complexity and jargon involved in their work. So translating what they do into plain talk doesn't come naturally. It's almost like unlearning what was learned in getting a PhD or an MD or an MPH. And I love to talk about this because I find it fascinating. And those of you who have worked with FDA understand this completely. We have a relatively high proportion of introverts in our workforce. And so many of our people are here at the FDA because they really love to deal with data, to make rational decisions, and aren't as interested or don't have the natural proclivity to go out and talk to people. But despite all these factors, we are taking it seriously. And it's why we asked for the report. So we certainly agree we need to redouble our efforts here at the FDA. Point's also well made that people trust their clinicians. And I just want to emphasize this again. We're well aware of it. And if we look at something like the vaccine situation today, I fear that we haven't convinced the clinical world that interest has been lost. I'm hearing a lot about this from friends and relatives about what their clinicians are recommending. So we've always tried to communicate with these trusted intermediaries, but we've got to increase the intensity and effectiveness of this communication, which I think in some ways is the same as communicating to the general public, but in some ways is quite different. So despite all these efforts, we find ourselves facing an unprecedented challenge to our continuing ability to fulfill this critical part of our mission. It's a change due in great part to the power of the internet, the digitization of our world, and the preponderance of what's commonly referred to as social media. And you all have done a great job of discussing this. And I mean, you also know that I worked for one of the big tech companies between my two FDA stints. So I'm not a Luddite. I don't want to return to the slide rule. I spent a career focusing on the importance of having more and better data to inform our scientific conclusions. And I've seen the power of technology for expanding healthcare, giving opportunities to people, particularly those who weren't included in the old system. I've seen how it's expanded opportunities for medical treatments and generating and sharing reliable evidence. That's why we worked hard at FDA to try to adopt cutting-edge technologies. But, you know, in the technology arms race, those of you who have worked in government also know that we have some handicaps in government, which is just another reason to say this can't all be done by government and shouldn't. We need everyone to pitch in. So this report focuses on technological changes that have increased the ability of many to accumulate and share resources and transcend previous existing boundaries with currently few or no standards to guide them. In the past, I always felt like our voice at FDA, back when I was a busy practicing cardiologist, FDA voice was authoritative and the communications ecosystem was relatively simple. There was a hierarchy of communication from the FDA to learned intermediaries. Now we're one of many voices in a cacophony of information and opinions. This exacerbates the impact is of the fact that many of those voices are intent on diminishing or undermining our role. There's certainly nothing wrong and plenty right about having many more voices or increased opportunities for information. Free speech is a foundation of our society. My concern comes when that speech poses an increased threat to public health, in great part because much of the information many of these voices put forward is unreliable or lacks scientific support and provides inaccurate and sometimes harmful information or misinformation, which can cause people to make plainly uninformed and adverse choices regarding their health. This has already been referred to, but Tuesday's Washington Post has 3 articles that I think should be required reading about the decline in longevity and other health parameters in our country. These articles really, both in terms of data, but also in terms of personal stories, draw the direct link between bad information, bad decisions, bad health, and higher rates of death. I mean, who would have thought the United States of America would be essentially in last place in life expectancy among high-income countries? And we're seeing a decline in life expectancy like we've never seen before, concentrated in areas where the people are most prone to be susceptible to misinformation. Many of those same voices also contribute directly to the longer-term undermining of trust in sources that are reliable and authoritative. And there's a general loss of trust in experts in general. FDA is part of this overall trend that's leading to the erosion of scientific facts. And yet, even as trust in the agencies dropped, at least partially as a result of these attacks, according to this report, the good news is that there remains a strong foundation for building back that trust. So I was heartened by the optimism of the panel, despite the large issue that we're trying to deal with. Let me offer one clear example from my field of expertise, if there is such a thing as a simple, clear example these days. In a recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll, 34% of Americans believe that COVID-19 vaccines either probably or actually do cause thousands of sudden deaths in otherwise healthy people. 34% of Americans. I spent my career studying sudden death and looked carefully at all of our post-marketing data about vaccines. This is simply wrong, but it sure explains why people are hesitant to get vaccinated. The fact is that those who are up to date on being vaccinated are much less likely to die. So there's a direct connection here. You're more likely to not be there for your family's holiday occasions coming up if you're not up to date on your vaccination. But here we have a belief state promulgated by frank misinformation. I'll make one final point, and this is a really delicate one that you all have alluded to, and it gets to the very nature of how, whether, and when we can respond to false claims and attacks on our work and activities. As the report accurately points out, misleading information that tends to more often be sensational or emotional often gets more attention than straightforward factual information. It also tends to spread faster. Mark Twain is often quoted. I'm not sure he was the one that really said this, but the old quote, "A lie travels around the globe while the truth is still putting on its shoes." There's another related issue, which is that the actions taken by the parties who are attacking and undermining our societal institutions like FDA can often prevent us from doing our job by putting limits on what we can say. You all have alluded to this. It's a very delicate issue. And clearly, I want to be clear, does not include suppressing other people's right to speak. We're not in that, we don't do that, and it's not part of our activity. But where do we go from here? We got to develop new and better ways to cut through and counter the misinformation and disinformation so we can meet our responsibilities and provide the public with the knowledge it needs to make informed decisions about health. While this report is not an examination per se of the FDA's work in this area, it does offer a number of options that we will take seriously and build upon what we're already doing to strengthen our response and help ensure we continue to be a trusted, reliable voice that can cut through the noise. There's some who would say the problem is far too big for us to respond to. And those who are committed to undermining science or diminishing trust in government scientific institutions are too numerous and too well financed to overcome. I won't deny this is an enormous challenge and can seem perplexing at every turn. It feels like a hydra, that mythical multi-headed serpent who would grow a new head every time one was chopped off. But it's essential that we try, not just for the work and reputation of the FDA, but the very health of our nation. And again, I want to refer you back to those Washington Post articles if you haven't read them. It'll require enormous collaboration across the agency, but also more broadly across the healthcare community. This is a challenge that goes to the structural foundation of our society, and it's a job far too big for any one agency to take on. But we got to respond. And I actually every day write down now as I think about this problem, a very simple statement that's attributed to George Moore. A winner is a loser who tried one more time. I would argue that right now we're not winning this battle, but with people like you, if we keep trying, we're going to figure it out. So thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, Commissioner, certainly, I think, as you noted in the panel observed, there's perhaps a ray of hope here, and to keep trying that one more time. We did have a question. We knew we would have some folks with questions today, and so I want to I see Dr. Tara Kirksell, who's associate professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. She's got a question, and Commissioner Califf, if you have time, we'd love to ask that question to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been a great webinar. My question here is, the central issue that we're talking about is trust. And you mentioned this in your comments. So my question is, what's the most important thing for FDA to do now and over the next few years to build further towards being a known and trustworthy agency that Americans can count on to make good decisions quickly when they're needed?
Well, Tara, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. And we are, as I've said, well aware that the premise of the question is on target. There has been an erosion of trust. But I'd also say that if you look at the polling data, there's still a large part of the population that does have a level of trust. So we have a basis to build on. That being said, though, we got a lot of work to do at the FDA and in the enterprise in general. I would say the first principle of gaining trust is to act trustworthy. And this means explaining things in plain language that people can understand. One important piece of this, I think, is that we have to find out a way to make clear that the decisions we reach and the recommendations we make are really designed for the good of the public. And telling people that so doesn't carry the day. And this is where I think the plain language becomes so important. And also letting people know that, particularly at the FDA, we're not prescriptive. We're not ordering people to do things or requiring it, but we are giving them the information we hope that they need to make the best decisions. And unfortunately, this impact, it's not abstract. This drop in life expectancy that we're seeing is a very real thing that's experienced every day. And so I really think this key is plain language, explaining what we need. I want to bring up one other issue that I think is hard, that hasn't come up in the discussion. I think it may have been mentioned one time. As we try to bring up plain language, full explanations, we have a deficit that is a special one at the FDA, is that often we have information which by law we cannot reveal. And one thing for sure about people that work at FDA, they follow the law. We work by a rule book. So there are times when we have information that literally it's illegal for us to reveal it. Now, I personally believe that this has gone too far, that we need to work with Congress and fix some of the laws so that it can be more transparency. I always harken back to clinicaltrials.gov. I was a clinical trialist for most of my career, and it never made sense to me that human experiments should be considered proprietary, commercially protected information by companies. You're going to do an experiment on human beings, it should be publicly available. Now that's a law, and it is publicly available. But we can't break the law. And the second part of this, which really makes our lives very difficult, is that we often know about a decision we're going to make. And I've heard you all say it'd be better to know ahead of time, but it's illegal for us to reveal that decision until the moment we do it, because many of our decisions affect stock prices. And we have to reveal all the information to everyone at the same time. We can't even reveal it to the people that, let's say, work for the company that's going to be involved. And so considering all these things, it's a challenge, but I think it's plain language. I'd ask you, do you have a quick phrase of what we should do? That you've spent your career studying this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the report outlines a lot of good tactics, I would say. You mentioned talking in ways that people understand, being trustworthy, and I would add, the decision making is because we all share the same values and beliefs. We want ourselves and our children to be safe, and we care about the safety that people are getting good products just like they do.
Tara, thank you so much. And Commissioner, we have one more questioner, Peter Pitts. Peter, are you with us? Yes, Peter, please unmute as you do this with the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest. Fire away.
Thanks, Susan. Happy American Pharmacist Month. Commissioner, l'audace, toujours l'audace, right? You've said that when it comes to battling myths and disinformation, that the FDA is in an asynchronous warfare situation. Now, historically, the way to deal with that is to gain the high ground, in this case, science, and to find powerful allies to help level the playing field. So in addition to this report's suggestions regarding improvements to internal FDA communications, processes, and practices, and with vaccines kind of being the sharp tip of the spear, how will the agency more regularly, robustly, and strategically partner with outside stakeholders to identify, develop, and execute targeted public health outreach efforts on the whole variety of key issues?
Yeah, Peter, I really appreciate that question. Just to reiterate a couple of points quickly before I launch into my attack mode, so to speak. First of all, you're correct to point out this is not just about vaccines, and I want to be really clear about that. If you go to those Washington Post articles, you'll see it's about tobacco, it's about food, it's about taking generic medications that are effective instead of ineffective treatments. Quite remarkable that it looks like it's almost as many Americans took hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin as ended up getting prescribed Paxlovid for COVID, which is quite a remarkable fact to think about. But it's about the whole gamut of things. And secondly, I just want to say again, we see a lot within the FDA that we need to continue to work on. Having said that, it's abundantly clear that we need the community to wake up and get more activated. I'll particularly point to professional groups. We need to communicate better with doctors, nurses, pharmacists, but we need them also to spend more time every day asking people about the information they're getting. I think during my work for a big tech company before, it was really remarkable to see how often people were getting their information from social media. And then when they went to the doctor's office, they weren't even asked about it. So the doctor didn't even know that they had a whole different belief state that was not being revealed. And I'd also point to our educational institutions. If the goal of our educational institutions is to discern the truth and promote it, I think there's a lot of fear right now for really engaging in this because it has become political. And while I don't want to be in the political sphere, when it comes to health, when we have clear facts, I think we have to be activated about it. Now, I heard in the panel the phrase coordinated response. And I think this may be the key phrase, because the thing that's abundantly clear is that the government cannot be the organizer of the coordinated response, if there is one. It's going to have to be a public-private partnership that's driven by the private sector because of the level of mistrust in government and the current view of many about what the role of government should be. So we want to play our role, but we call upon you to help figure out, among all the other entities that have much at stake in this effort, how to work together. And I want to call out one other thing, interactive strategies. And those of you who are government aficionados hopefully will resonate to this. But one thing I learned working for a big tech companies, it's entirely possible to communicate with billions of people at the same time right now. But we have a little thing in government called the Paperwork Reduction Act that keeps us from interacting with people directly in the way that would be most effective, or even asking them what they think. I think we got to figure out about that, because we spend, as many of you know, a lot of time right now with patient groups, with consumer groups that are represented by people who we have a lot of reliance on and a lot of respect for. But it would be a lot better if we could interact directly with bigger parts of the American public to find out what they are thinking and what their knowledge gaps are and what they'd like to know. But right now, we have limitations on doing that. And as I'll keep reiterating, one thing we are at FDA is we follow the law. And so really call back to you to help us figure out what a coordinated response looks like, because it can't be run by the government. And we hope you'll pick this up.
I'll certainly pick up the gauntlet on that, as will, I'm sure, everybody on this call. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. And with that, we have reached the end of our time, but not the end of our work. So we'll look forward to that collaboration. Commissioner Califf, we're ready to help you. As you know, that's the only reason that we exist. And so we will look forward to follow up. I want to thank all of our panelists, our medical students, those who asked questions, you, Commissioner, and everyone who joined us today. That concludes our meeting, and we look forward. I hope that the rest of your day is productive. Take care.